Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me now? All right. So we want to welcome today a very special guest. Jim Helms is a member of our museum foundation, a former mayor of Arcadia, and I'm sure the list goes on and on. He's shaking his head at me. So I'm not going to go any further. But we're very excited to have Jim Helms talking today on the history of fraternal organizations in Arcadia.
Thank you, Dana. You know, when Dana first talked to me about doing this, I had envisioned one table with 2 or 3 people on it, and we just sort of have a chat. I wasn't quite prepared for so many. But as I thought about the history of Arcadia, each one of us has our own history. We're all walking historians. We all have stories to tell, where you're born, where you're raised on the farm, or where, you know, what your life was all about. And cities have the same history. And when you go to a city, I think the general idea is you accept it as it is. This is the way it always has been. And I think the newcomers coming to Arcadia today probably look at Arcadia thinking it was always this way. And I know you had people speak to you who were born and raised in Arcadia. They have a great more insight on what's changed than I do. But my experience in Arcadia goes back 60 years. And things have changed a lot. 60 years ago, of course, there was no freeway. There was no mall. There was a racetrack, or grass track, I think, where the mall is today. The Arboretum was not an Arboretum. It was a place that had gone to rack and weed. That's to for a new phrase. And Baldwin Avenue stopped at Colorado. You had to go across the railroad tracks on foot. The other side was Lucky Baldwin's train station, which is now in the Arboretum, which was, we all got together with money and had it moved down there. And there was also a train station in downtown Arcadia, and I think that station is now out in the county fairgrounds. So a lot of things have changed. West Arcadia had Henshaw's were pretty new. Nash had been here a little longer. There were a lot of stores that had been here for a while, but the advent of Nash's and Henshaw's spelled the downfall of downtown Arcadia, which I think is from Santa Anita to 2nd Avenue and whatnot in that area. But it was still a pretty busy place. Over in that part of town, there were 3 lumber yards. Why we had 3, I don't know. There was one where REI is now. There was one next to the post office, and part of that building is still there. There was one over pretty where Embassy Suites is. That one burned down. And the story was that 2 kids had burned it down. And the CIA told me that those kids lived on my block. Now, you think CIA, the intelligence agency back in Washington? No. It's the Children's Intelligence Agency. There were so many kids on my block that if anything happened in one house, it was down the other end of the street. Everybody knew about it in light times, instantly. The news traveled faster than light. So, but there was the tag into that story is I think those 2 boys are now police officers someplace. So. Baldwin Avenue, my first office was on Baldwin Avenue, and it was like a storm drain. When it rained, we had to put sandbags out in front to keep the water in. And El Monte Avenue was truly a drain. You could hardly drive across it. Of course, there was no Sunday racing. That was a different thing. In downtown Arcadia, there was Hartzler Shoes, where my kids all got their little Mary Janes. Long's Men's Store, where I bought my clothes. King Pharmacy, Arcadia Pharmacy. On the corner of First and Huntington, there was a thrifty drugstore. There were 3 hardware stores. Why we had 3, I don't know. Arcadia Stationers, there were 2 or 3 markets. The Market Basket was where the Arcadia, the credit union is today. And there was a market where the windmill is, where the Denny's restaurant is. And there was so much more going on. It was a busy place. And on Baldwin Avenue, there was Bates Chevrolet that was built, and that lasted for a few years. Now it's a restaurant. I always thought they put the salad oil where they used to have the cranky oil. The city library was on First Avenue, and it was old and antiquated, and it leaked. It was not a very nice place to go. I remember going down to look for something in the basement. It was pretty dusty. We had one fire station right around the corner on Wheeler, and it had a fire pole in it. And I always wanted to slide down that pole, but I never got a chance to do that. And when they built a new fire station, they tore that one down, and that fire pole disappeared. It was a while before we found out that it had been cut up in pieces. Every one of the firemen took a piece home. They all had their own memoirs. Lucky Baldwin's train station, you know, there's a story, and this is true, that in the deeds to the houses up in that area, Lucky Baldwin reserved the right to stop the train at his station. And there was one story that he came back from hunting bear up at Big Bear, and he wanted to get a train ticket to Arcadia from San Bernardino. And the ticket master said, no, we don't stop in San Bernardino, or in Arcadia. We don't stop there. And he said, no, you're going to stop there. And they said, no, I won't. And so Lucky Baldwin said, well, take this telegram to my foreman. And the message was very simple. It says, start tearing up the tracks. And so he got his ticket to Arcadia. And when the Elks, the second year the Elks were here, the Exalted Ruler lived in that area behind the Arboretum. And they took a whole group of Elks back to Chicago for the National Convention. They had the train stop at Lucky Baldwin Station, and they all got on there. So it was that's the kind of story that I like to tell. The Pacific Electric red car tracks were down Huntington Drive. They were still here. I gotta get my notes so I don't get too lost here. We had our own bi-weekly newspaper, the Arcadia Tribune. Hal Roots was the editor, or the publisher. And there was a writer called Bill DeMuth. Anybody remember Bill DeMuth? Anybody here? Well, he was a man that you either liked or hated, and he returned the favor. We had just separated our school system from Monrovia Duarte, built our own high school. And so I put my office on Baldwin Avenue at that time. And the state bar had rules that you could not advertise, period. You couldn't put an ad in the paper. You couldn't make your name any bigger than anyone else's in the telephone book. You couldn't do anything. You could put your sign out there and that was it. So I didn't know anybody here, and I knew I had to become part of the fabric of the city in order to make it go. I looked around, I realized that Arcadia was one of the most organized cities in the world. There was a club for almost any activity that you wanted. It was bridge clubs, garden clubs, submediums, radio clubs, you name it, we had a club for it. And there was also the Rotary Club, the Kiwanis, the Lions, and the New Exchange Club. I wanted to join the Rotary, but there were already lawyers in the Rotary Club and they didn't want me in. And at one time, the Rotarians had a law that you could only have one of each. One lawyer, one doctor, one... And there's a story, maybe Don knows the answer to this, that one club had a minister in it, and a bishop wanted to join. They said, oh, we already have a religious person. So they thought about it, and then they decided, okay, we'll have one religion wholesale, one religion retail. So I joined the Exchange Club and was eventually the president of that club. The Chamber of Commerce had its office in the Beekings building, had a junior chamber. There was the Arcadia Community Chest. That was before the, what's the other charity group that comes to town? No, the big one. They took over the community chest work. No. But anyway, we used to have our own community chest, and I was involved in that. We raised money. We had several charities that we took care of. There was a women's club, which is still here. The Assistants League is still here, and many more. At that time, and this I think is really quite interesting, I think we were very civic-minded, our city. We were culturally, civically, intellectually, and religiously homogeneous. We got along well together. Politics, both for school board and city council, were actively debated, as well as state and national affairs. I think there was a greater percentage of people that voted in the elections in those days. During the 50s to the 70s, the many service clubs in Arcadia, the churches, all the organizations flourished. There was a great deal of activity in that period. And we had 3 fraternal orders. As we get to the top, well, you finally get to the topic of my song. Right? Go around the bush for a ways. But this sort of ties in. That's segued in. We had the Free and Accepted Masons, the Knights of Columbus, and the St. Gabriel Valley Shrine Club. The Elks came a little bit later. The oldest of those groups in point of time in Arcadia and in existence are the Masons. Freemasonry traces its roots to the Middle Ages, when the great cathedrals and palaces of Europe were constructed. The generally accepted theory is that the stonemasons who built those great cathedrals established guilds like our labor unions today to control their members and to decide who was qualified to be a master mason. And they did it in secret, that if you moved from one town to another, you had to be able to convince the people there that you were indeed a master mason. So they didn't let the word out. You had to know. And at the time our nation was born, many of the leading citizens of our time were Masons. George Washington was a Mason, Ben Franklin, Paul Revere, John Adams, Samuel Adams, Ethan Allen, John Hancock, and many, many more. Most of the generals of Washington's army were Masons. Today, Masons do not talk about politics in their lodges, but it's believed that people like Paul Revere, who was a Mason, discussed the issues of the day and relied on the code of secrecy of the organization to protect them from the British. The room above the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston is where it said that the details of the Boston Tea Party were hatched out. And many of the people that took part in that were Masons, although it was not a Masonic activity as such. There is a story I think is kind of interesting about the Revolution, that a young French nobleman came to this country and wanted to help Washington in the Revolution. He wanted to be a general. The only military training he had was marching the city kids around with the sticks on their shoulders. That was his claim to fame. But he went to Philadelphia to talk to John Hancock, who was president of the Continental Congress. And Hancock wouldn't see him. We got enough French generals over here now, we don't anymore. They had enough foreigners to help him out. And so this young man sat down and wrote a letter to John Hancock, and at the end of it, put some Masonic symbols. Well, Hancock was a Mason. When he saw those, he sent one of his aides, who was also a Mason, out to give this guy the 3rd degree to make sure he really was a Mason. And he passed the test. And so he became one of Washington's generals, but his army consisted of one man. That was his valet. That was all he could have. And that was the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, of course, Masonry was in full bloom throughout the country until 1826. There was something happened then that was dealt a very damaging blow to Masonry. It was called the William Morgan affair. William Morgan was a man who claimed to be a Mason, but nobody could ever prove that he was. There's no record that he ever became a Mason. But somehow he'd gotten into some of the organizations and learned some of the secrets. And he lived in Batavia, New York, which is a little town between Rochester and Buffalo. And he applied for membership in one of the Masonic orders and got blackballed. And so he said, I'm going to write a book, and he did, about all the secrets of Freemasonry. And it hadn't been yet published, but he was going around telling everybody he'd done it. And people didn't like him to start with, and when he started doing that, they didn't like him even more. And he got arrested for some petty crime and was finally discharged. And when he was discharged, 4 men picked him up in a wagon and took him off, and he was never seen again. And of course, there's the old story, they were tried, but the judge was a Mason, the prosecuting attorney was a Mason, the defense attorney was a Mason, the jury were all Masons. So, well, no, they did convict those guys of kidnapping, and they spent a little time in jail, but not much. But they never found his body, and they never had anybody charged with his murder. And that reminded me of, anybody remember Helen Throsby Scott? The case here in L.A. many years ago. She was a socialite in Beverly Hills, and her husband, a doctor, was accused of having killed her. And they convicted him of her murder, but they never found his body. And the theory is that she's buried in the concrete out at one of the freeways in West L.A. someplace, along with Jimmy Hoffa. Anyway, because of the Morgan affair, there was a great deal of animosity generated throughout the New England area against Masonry. And that lasted for a few years, and there was even a politician in New York called Thurlow Weed, who founded an anti-Masonic party to oppose Andrew Jackson in 1832. Well, of course, Jackson won, and that party was short-lived. It disbanded, and eventually the Masonic hatred disappeared. Now, the 49ers brought Masonry to California, to Northern California. And if you travel to Sutter's Creek in the Mother Lode country, you will see a town that has hardly changed since the gold rush days. And also a Masonic lodge, which is in a building on the main street, which shares the building with the Oddfellows. This is another fraternal order. And they have owned that building jointly since the gold rush days. So Freemasonry is one of the world's largest fraternities and has lodged in almost all of the free world. Masonry came to Arcadia in 1922. That's even, some of you don't know that, but it was really before I was born, I think. Way back, way before I was born. The formation committee was held in the Arcadia City Hall, and after a few more meetings, they elected a master and a senior warden, and they received their approval of their charter as a lodge that were instituted in 1923, in February of 1923. So we've been here ever since. In the beginning, the lodge met in the Monrovian Lodge and the Sierra Madre Lodge. But his first Arcadia home was a building erected by a brother Fred Stockman on the north side of Huntington Drive between Santa Anita and 2nd Avenue. It was 2 stories high and served the lodge until 1935, when Huntington Drive was widened. And they had to make some adjustments to the building at that time, which made it unsuitable for the lodge. So for a couple of years, they were without a home. And then brothers Charles Faulkner and Irving Murfitt. Have anybody heard those names before? They apparently knew Anita Baldwin very well. And they prevailed upon her to make a favorable offer to the lodge for some property that she owned on the east side of Santa Anita, just below El Dorado. And so the lodge bought that property, and the building was dedicated in 1937. And during the years that followed, additional lots around the building were purchased. The lodge grew, and they outgrew that building. And in 1962, this, Mary Beth, you know nothing about this a little bit, the city traded the Masons some lots of property they had on the west side of the library, square foot for square foot, for the property that the Masons owned on first Santa Anita. And that was because the city had acquired all that property. They wanted to build a library. They wanted to build an auditorium. And that bond issue went down to flaming defeat. And they built the library without bond money. They got around it. I've forgotten all the details, but that's how they did it. And so they had this property on the west side of the library that they were no longer going to use. And that's what they traded to Masons, and that's where the building is now. And that building was dedicated in 1965. Now the next fraternal order that we had in Arcadia was the San Gabriel Valley Shrine Club. The Shrine Club was in full swing in 1950, but its history, the details, all of its records are locked in the archives of the Al Malaika Shrine in Los Angeles. They have no one on their staff to go look for the records. At least they wouldn't buzz when I asked them for them. The Shrine Club met in a building now occupied by the Elks at 27 West Huntington Drive. And I'm told it was a very, very active group. 2 of the names associated with Herb Goddard and Joe Earl. Anybody know those two names? Herb Goddard and Joe Earl. They're both relatives here in town. Unfortunately, all the other members are deceased. The only one that I know that's still alive, I can't think who he is anymore, so I can't talk to him. But in 1958, the Grand Potentate of the Shriners issued a decree that the clubs could not occupy a building housing a bar. Well, the building on Huntington Drive has a big bar, and if you ever go in there, it's the Elks Lodge now. Behind the bar is a back bar. And I understand that back bar came around the Horn on a clipper ship many years ago. So they had to sell that lot, they had to sell that building. And the Elks had just been formed and were renting from them, so they sold the building to the Elks. The Shrine Club continued to rent the building for some time and then moved on, and at this point the available history of the club ends. The only artifact that I could find is a spin the coin drawing used to decide who would buy the next round of drinks. I have some copies here. Dana? You want to pass those out, please? So the third group that we had at Arcadia are the Knights of Columbus. The Knights of Columbus were the next fraternal order to come to Arcadia. It is a fraternal beneficent society of Catholic men founded in New Haven, Connecticut in February of 1882. The express purpose of the society is to promote Catholic education and charity, and through its insurance department to furnish at least temporary financial aid to the families of deceased members. The order grew rapidly and is now established in every state, Canada, Philippines, Mexico, Cuba, Panama, Puerto Rico, and South America. The order now boasts a membership of 1.7 million. The Arcadia Council was instituted October the 12th, 1947, as Arcadia number 3073. But in 1951, they changed their name to the Archbishop Cantwell Society, Council. The first Grand Knight was Cliff Malumpley, and the chaplain was the beloved Monsignor Gerald O'Keefe. How many knew Gerald O'Keefe? He was here for a long time. The council building is on First Avenue, just south of the First Avenue Middle School. It was dedicated in 1954. They claim to have members, 125 members, and they meet the second Thursday of each month. The Knights of Columbus, like the Masons, have 3 degrees. They are charity, unity, and fraternity. And the current Grand Knight is Ben Doldy. Am I coming on time? Okay. The fourth fraternal order to come in Arcadia were the Elks. Now, I told you at the beginning, I'm not a historian. I don't have time to go to all the primary sources. I have to use secondary sources. But here I am the primary source. I know all about this one. I have an intimate relationship with this because I was the chairman of the organizing committee in the first exalted ruler in 1957. In the fall of '56, I, together with 5 other men, were invited to a meeting to discuss the possibility of forming an Elks Lodge in Arcadia. The organizing committee was formed, and we began to hold weekly meetings at the Arcadia Tribune building. Each week, the number of men attending increased, and in a short time, it was necessary to move the building to the meetings to the National Guard Armory. Anybody know where the National Guard Armory was? Yeah, some of you. Well, it's where the police station is today. We probably gave that land to the state to put the armory on it many years ago. But when we wanted it back, they made us pay for it. That's dealing with the state. We were told that we had to have 400 applications paid up before they would charter us. And that event occurred in April of 1957. The institution of the lodge was held in the Arcadia High School gymnasium. It was an impressive sight with 400 of the leading men of Arcadian Temple City lined up to enter the gym. The lodge rented the use of the San Gabriel Valley Shrine Club on Huntington Drive. But after a year or two, the Shrine Club was forced to sell the property, and the Elks bought it. They formed a corporation, a nonprofit corporation, to buy the land. And 50 years later, when the city wanted to buy that property from the Elks, nobody knew it, but I was the owner of it. There had been a half a dozen members of this nonprofit corporation. I was the only one still alive. And nobody came to me to ask to buy it, so I didn't offer to sell it. But nobody knew, except me. And that issue has now been corrected. In case I die, they still have ownership of it. I may, just in case. In the 1980s, there was a lawsuit against the Duarte Rotary Club, sponsored by one of the lawyers in Arcadia Rotary Club, because they denied admission to the Rotary Club of women. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court, And the Supreme Court says, yeah, if you're a business association or you have any contact with the government, you have to play by the rules and you have to have women as members. So the Arcadia Elks Lodge now, and all other Elks Lodges, I think, have amended their rules, and they have women. They have almost as many women as have men. The current exalted ruler of the Arcadia Elks Lodge is a very bright lady. She's a good one. And she, I think, is the second lady to hold that job. I'm told that the Elks Lodge here in Arcadia today has a membership of over 300 members. Now, I have to tell you a little bit about the basis of the Elks. They were formed in 1867, and their initial name were the Jolly Corks. The Jolly Corks. It was a drinking society of Broadway showmen. The leading guy was a singer and a variety actor. And this group of about 15 guys got together and they had parties. They each carried a cork, a champagne cork. And if they got caught without a cork, they had to buy the drinks. And if a new man wanted to join, they had this little trick that they play on. They all put their corks on the table and put their hands over and say, okay, now, when the master counts to 3, you're going to pull the cork off the table. The last one to pull his cork off buys a drink. And of course, the master counted to 3, and the new guy